November 6th, 1895. New York. The corner of Fifth Avenue and 53rd Street. If you had found yourself in the crowd of onlookers that morning, you would have seen a scene worthy of a monarch's coronation. Police cordons were barely holding back the press of 2,000 people who had come just to look at the carriages. Women were fainting in the crush. Men were climbing lampposts to catch even a glimpse of the bride. Newspaper boys were shouting headlines about the event of the century. This was the triumph of American capital. This was the day when dollars from the old world bought titles from the new. But if you could have peered inside the closed carriage approaching St. Thomas's Church, you would have seen not a radiant bride, but an 18-year-old girl whose face had turned into a puffy mask from endless tears. Her name was Consuelo Vanderbilt, and at that moment, she was the most expensive commodity in human history. She wore a dress of ivory-colored satin, whose train stretched 5 meters. In her hands trembled a bouquet of rare orchids, delivered from the White House greenhouses. Around her neck hung a strand of pearls worth a fortune. But beneath this splendor hid a horrific detail. The girl's eyes were so red and swollen from nightly sobbing that her governess had to apply ice compresses to them for the last 20 minutes so that the bride could at least see the way to the altar. Next to her in the carriage sat not a loving father, but her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, a woman who was not holding her daughter's hand, but escorting her. Alva looked at her daughter not with tenderness, but with the cold calculation of an appraiser transporting a rare diamond to auction. For the mother, the daughter's tears were merely an annoying hindrance, a technical glitch in a perfectly planned business operation. In the church, the groom awaited them, Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough. A man with one of the loudest titles in the British Empire and one of the emptiest bank accounts in Europe. He was shorter than the bride, looked at Americans as savages with checkbooks, and most importantly, he didn't love Consuelo either. His heart belonged to another woman, but that woman didn't have the money to fix the roof of his ancestral castle. But Consuelo did. Let's pause for a second and count. We love to romanticize the past, imagining balls and fans, but let's look at the ledger of this marriage. Consuelo's dowry amounted to $2.5 million in shares of the Beach Creek Railroad Company. To give you an idea of the scale, adjusted for 2024 rates, this is an amount close to $100 million. This was not a gift to the young couple for setting up house. This was the purchase price. Exactly that much it cost to transform the American Miss Vanderbilt into the English Duchess of Marlborough. The contract was signed by lawyers one day before the wedding. It had 4 points. The Duke received a guaranteed annual income. The Duke received repairs to his palace. The Duke received shares. And the Vanderbilt family received access to high society, which had closed its doors to them for years, considering them vulgar upstarts. The only person whose opinion was not taken into account in this hundreds of pages contract was Consuelo herself. When the church doors swung open, the organ blared the march. Consuelo walked to the altar as if to the scaffold. Later, she would write in her memoirs that she kept staring at one spot the whole time, afraid to meet the eyes of anyone she knew because it would trigger a new fit of hysterics. She knew what the guests in diamonds and velvet did not. She knew that just yesterday she had begged her mother to cancel the wedding. She knew that she had a beloved, Winthrop Rutherford, whom she wanted to marry. And she knew what her mother had replied. "I would sooner see you dead at my feet than married to that man." This was no figure of speech. A few weeks before the wedding, Alva locked her daughter in a room, posted guards, and simulated a heart attack, declaring that she would die if Consuelo did not agree to this marriage. This was blackmail of the highest order. psychological abuse wrapped in silk and gold. And now, standing at the altar, Consuelo was reciting vows of fidelity to a man who, immediately after the ceremony in the hotel elevator, would tell her to her face, "I married you only to save Blenheim Palace." The irony of fate is that this sacrifice truly changed history, but not in the way the deal's participants planned. The money of the unhappy Consuelo saved the Blenheim estate in Oxfordshire from ruin. It was precisely these American dollars that allowed the Spencer Churchill family to keep a roof over their heads. If not for this cynical marriage, we might not have one of the 20th century's greatest politicians. For it was in this saved palace that the groom's cousin, Sir Winston Churchill, was born and raised. The Great Britain was able to shape the destinies of the world, in large part, thanks to the tears of an American girl shed on that cold November morning. But how did we arrive at this point? How did the Vanderbilt family, starting their journey with one leaky boat and a few coins in their pocket, achieve such might that they could buy dukes like pedigree stallions? And why, in this family, which possessed money exceeding the budget of the United States Treasury, was happiness the most scarce resource? To understand Consuelo's tragedy, we need to rewind the tape back. We need to return to the very beginning, to the man who created this golden trap, to the man who knew no pity for either enemies or his own children, to the first Vanderbilt, to the Commodore. To understand why Consuelo stood at the altar in a diamond collar, we need to go back 100 years, not to ballrooms, but to the mud of New York Harbor at the end of the 18th century. There, amid sailors cursing, the smell of rotten fish and coal soot, Cornelius Vanderbilt was born, our heroine's great-grandfather. A man who didn't just earn this money, he gnawed it out. Cornelius dropped out of school at 11 years old. He could barely read and write with grammatical errors until the end of his days, but he knew how to count every cent as if his life depended on it. Legend has it that at 16 he borrowed $100 from his mother, a considerable sum by the standards of the time, to buy a flat-bottomed boat, a so-called pirogue. That was his first asset, his first office, and his first battlefield. He started by ferrying farmers and cargo from Staten Island to Manhattan. He worked 18 hours a day. In storms, in freezing rain, when other boatmen sat in taverns, Cornelius was on the water. He was a tough, rough guy with pood-sized fists who could knock anyone off their feet with one blow if they tried to stand in his way. Very soon he earned the nickname Commodore. At first it was mockery, a joke at his ambitions, but a couple of decades later, this nickname would be spoken with awe in Washington and on Wall Street. The Commodore's business philosophy was simple and brutal. Destroy the competitor. Don't negotiate, don't buy, but destroy. He started price wars, dropping the cost of tickets on his steamboats to zero, operating at a loss for months until his rivals went bankrupt. As soon as the competitor vanished, Vanderbilt raised prices and took everything. He didn't believe in rules. When accused of breaking the law, he uttered the phrase that became legendary. "The law? What do I care for the law? Haven't I got the power?" By the mid-19th century, he realized that the future lay not in water, but in iron. He sold his fleet and invested everything in railroads. It was a risk that turned his banker's hair gray, but the Commodore was not mistaken. He created the New York Central, the main transport artery connecting New York to Chicago. If you wanted to transport grain, steel, or people on the East Coast, you paid Vanderbilt. By the time of his death in 1877, Cornelius Vanderbilt possessed a fortune of $100 million. So you understand the scale. At a time when an ordinary worker earned $1 a day, Vanderbilt owned a sum that exceeded the gold reserves of the United States Treasury. He was richer than the state in which he lived. But here's what's interesting. The man who possessed boundless power despised the luxury for which his family would later become famous. He lived in a relatively modest house on Washington Place. He wore simple black clothes, chewed tobacco, and spat on the carpets, even when receiving ministers. He didn't care about New York high society, the Knickerbockers, descendants of Dutch settlers, who looked at him as an uncouth peasant. "I don't need to be loved, I need to be feared," he said. Terror reigned in his house. He considered his children weaklings and parasites. His eldest son and heir, William Henry, Consuelo's grandfather, he called a dolt and blockhead right in front of the servants. He banished his son to the farm for years, making him deal with manure to beat the nonsense out of him. The Commodore was convinced. Big money requires a steel character, and his children had grown up in comfort. As he was dying, the Commodore committed an act that predetermined Consuelo's fate. He did not divide the fortune equally. He was panic-strickenly afraid that his empire would be torn apart. Therefore, he left 95% of his wealth, about $95 million, to that same stupid son, William Henry, who by that time had proven his loyalty and ability for ruthless economizing. The other children got scraps. The Commodore was dying in his bedroom, surrounded by doctors and mediums, believing that he was leaving a great legacy. He thought he had created a dynasty of warriors. He could not imagine that in just 20 years, his grandchildren and great-grandchildren would turn his bloody, hard-earned iron money into the most meaningless Vanity Fair in human history. The old man saved every cent so that his great-granddaughter could buy herself a duke. The Commodore's death broke the seal. The enormous capital passed into the hands of people who, unlike the founder, desperately wanted not just power. They wanted that very elite, which turned up its nose at the Commodore's spits, now to bow to them at the waist. A new era was dawning. The era that Mark Twain would call the Gilded Age. Outside, a thin layer of gold. Inside, rot, complexes, and unrestrained competition in spending. It was precisely in this atmosphere of hysterical luxury that our heroine would be born. When the coffin with the body of the old Commodore was lowered into the ground, New York breathed out. But this exhale was premature. If the founder of the dynasty was a predator who killed for food, then his heirs turned into predators who killed for entertainment. The death of the patriarch opened the floodgates to a flow of money of such power that it could wash away the morality of any person. The Commodore's son, William Henry, was a workaholic who doubled his father's fortune to $200 million. As he was dying, he was the richest man on the planet. But it was precisely his children, the third generation of Vanderbilts, to which our Consuelo's father belonged, who became the architects of what Mark Twain, with a sardonic smirk, dubbed the Gilded Age. Twain did not choose this word in vain. Not golden, but precisely gilded, the thinnest layer of gold leaf, beneath which hid cheap cast iron, social inequality, and spiritual emptiness. The generation of Consuelo's father no longer knew what it was like to freeze in a boat in the harbor. They did not know the smell of coal dust. They were born on silk sheets and grew up with the conviction that the world was their personal playground. If the Commodore earned money, then his grandsons made spending it their profession. The most expensive and meaningless arms race in New York history began. Only instead of cannons, they used mansions, and instead of shells, pearl necklaces. The epicenter of this war became Fifth Avenue. Before the Vanderbilts, old aristocrats lived there in modest brick houses. The Commodore's grandsons demolished this modesty with bulldozers. On the stretch between 50th and 59th Streets, 7 Vanderbilt palaces rose. The press called this block the Vanderbilt Row, but in essence it was an exhibition of complexes. Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, together with his ambitious wife, Alva, decided to build a house that would shut everyone up. At the address 5th Avenue 660, they erected the Petit Chateau. It was not a house in the usual understanding. It was a copy of a French castle from the time of Francis I, transplanted to the center of Manhattan. From Europe they brought not just furniture, they brought entire rooms. Ancient fireplaces were ripped out from Loire castles. Wooden panels that remembered kings were removed from walls and shipped by steamer to New York. Inside this stone monster, life resembled a theatrical production. Dinner ceased to be a meal. It became a ritual of demonstrating solvency. The menu of one ordinary banquet could cost as much as the annual earnings of 100 workers on the Vanderbilt's railroad, who brought in that very money. The culmination of this madness was the costume ball on the 26th of March, 1883. This event entered history textbooks as the moment when America lost its shame. Alva Vanderbilt spent $250,000 on organizing one evening. Adjusted for modern money, that's about $7 million. For 6 hours of dancing and drinking. The guests competed in the absurdity of their costumes. Alva's daughter-in-law, Alice Vanderbilt, arrived in an outfit called Electric Light. It was a dress of yellow satin embroidered with diamonds, and in her hand she held a real electric torch with a battery hidden in the folds of her skirt. This was a slap in the face of poverty. While in the East Side slums, children were dying of tuberculosis in the dark, the Vanderbilts played with diamond-encrusted light bulbs. Alva herself was dressed as a Venetian princess, surrounded by her entourage, and posed for photographers like a real royal personage. But behind this sparkle hid rot. The men of this generation, deprived of the need to work, suffered from boredom. Consuelo's father spent his time at racetracks and on yachts, collecting horses and mistresses with equal enthusiasm. The women, locked in golden cages of corsets and etiquette, went mad from idleness and directed all their energy into intrigues. Little Consuelo grew up precisely in these surroundings. She saw a father who bought her off with expensive dolls, and a mother who saw her as a project. Consuelo's nursery was on the top floor of the Petit Chateau. From the window, she saw the city that she was not allowed to visit. She had French governesses, German teachers, but not a single friend. She was taught to curtsy, to wear a train, and to distinguish 12 types of forks, but no one taught her to be happy. She was a princess in a limestone tower, and she did not yet know that this palace was not a fortress, but a training camp. Alva Vanderbilt was preparing her daughter for the main battle of her life. Despite all the millions, despite the palaces and yachts, the family had one problem. The old New York elite, those very Knickerbockers, still considered the Vanderbilts vulgar upstarts and did not invite them into their drawing rooms. And Alva decided that if the New York snobs didn't want to open the doors to her, she would batter down those doors with a ram. And the role of the ram was to be played by her daughter. In late 19th century New York, there were two currencies. The first was dollars, printed in Washington and earned in factories. The second currency was valued much higher, and it couldn't be obtained from a bank. This was reputation. And if with the first currency the Vanderbilts had no problems, they could buy all of Manhattan, then with the second, they were bankrupt. The war declared by Consuelo's mother was not for oil or iron ore. This was a war for the right to enter one specific drawing room. Enemy number one was Mrs. Caroline Schermerhorn Astor, a monolithic woman, the uncrowned queen of New York. She lived in a boring brick mansion at the corner of 34th Street and 5th Avenue, where the Empire State Building now stands, and possessed absolute power. It was she who decided who in the city was a respectable person and who was a vulgar upstart. For Mrs. Astor, the Vanderbilt name was a synonym for bad taste. She called them innkeepers and railroaders. In her world, money had to be old, lying in chests for at least 3 generations so that the smell of sweat would evaporate. She had an assistant, Ward McAllister, who compiled the famous 400 list. Exactly as many people as Mrs. Astor's ballroom could hold. And exactly that many people, in her opinion, made up New York high society. The Vanderbilts were not on this list. This was a public humiliation that burned Alva Vanderbilt from the inside. She built her French castle right under the windows of the old elite, not just like that. This was a siege tower. But the walls of old society remained deaf. The Knickerbockers' carriages passed by the Vanderbilts' house as if it were an empty lot. Mrs. Astor's liveried footmen never left their calling cards on Alva's silver tray in the hall. In the etiquette of that time, this meant social death. You do not exist. Then, Alva employed a tactic worthy of a general. She used her own children and the enemy's children as pawns. When that very legendary costume ball was announced, all young New York went mad with anticipation. Mrs. Astor's daughter, young Carrie, was already rehearsing the quadrille with her friends, preparing to shine at the party of the century. And then Alva struck. She spread a rumor and then officially confirmed Miss Carrie Astor could not be invited to the ball. The reason was formal and murderously polite. Since Mrs. Astor has never paid a visit to the Vanderbilts' house, we unfortunately are not acquainted with her daughter, and inviting strangers is bad form. This was checkmate. Young Carrie sobbed. Mrs. Astor faced a choice: either break her own daughter's heart and admit that someone dared to dictate terms to her, or swallow her pride. The great lady surrendered. On one cloudy afternoon, Mrs. Astor's black carriage stopped at the doors of the Vanderbilts' palace. The footman in blue livery ascended the steps and left the coveted calling card on Alva's butler's tray. The fortress fell. The Vanderbilts were officially recognized. But for Alva, this was not enough. Victory over New York seemed too easy, too small to her. Her ambitions grew along with her husband's fortune. If in America they became kings, why not intermarry with real kings of Europe? In 1892, to consolidate her status, Alva completed the construction of another weapon, a summer residence in Newport, Rhode Island. The house was named Marble House. It cost $11 million to build. Adjusted for modern money, taking into account the uniqueness of the materials, this is more than $350 million. This house was not intended for living. It was a temple of cold and wealth. 500,000 cubic feet of marble were brought from Italy. The interiors were literally stripped from Versailles and the Petit Trianon. Chairs made of solid gold, ceilings painted by the best masters of Europe. But behind this facade hid a prison. It was precisely here, in the Marble House, that Alva began the final stage of processing her daughter. By that time, Consuelo had turned into a beauty. Tall, with a long, graceful neck, huge, dark eyes, and manners honed to automatism. She was the ideal product of Alva's upbringing. But the product had a defect. Consuelo had her own opinion. she fell in love. Her chosen one was Winthrop Rutherford. Handsome, rich, from a good family, one of the most eligible bachelors in New York. Any mother would be happy. Any except Alva. "We didn't build palaces for you to marry a mere American," the mother declared. In her eyes, Rutherford was nobody. He was not a duke. He was not a prince. He did not have a coat of arms 500 years old. Alva Vanderbilt decided to convert her millions into a title. She did not need her daughter's love. She needed a crown on the calling card. The hunt began. Alva took her daughter to Europe like one takes a prize mare to an international exhibition. Season in London, season in Paris. Agents and society matchmakers searched for a suitable match. The requirements were simple. The title had to be loud, and the groom's financial situation catastrophic, because only a bankrupt would agree to Alva's terms. And such a man was found. His Grace Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, owner of one of England's most grandiose palaces, and debts that were pulling him to the bottom. The deal of the century began to take shape. By the end of the 19th century, a new type of export appeared in the ports of the United States. It was not cotton, tobacco, or steel. It was girls. They entered history under the cynical but accurate name, dollar princesses. This was one of the largest capital transfer operations in history. American industrial money was exchanged for European aristocratic crests. More than 200 heiresses crossed the Atlantic to save the decaying British aristocracy from bankruptcy. The thing is, in England at that time, an agricultural depression was raging. The land that had fed lords and earls for centuries devalued. Ancient castles, which tourists so admired, turned into black holes sucking out the last pounds. Roofs leaked, tapestries rotted, and proud title holders sat in unheated libraries, selling family silver to buy firewood. They needed money, urgently, and they found the perfect bank: vain American millionaires. Charles Spencer Churchill, 9th Duke of Marlborough, was a classic example of such a bankrupt. He was called Sonny, Sunshine, but this nickname was not from his character, but from his secondary title, Earl of Sunderland. In reality, Sonny was a gloomy, arrogant man who sincerely believed that his title made him a higher being. But he had a problem. His ancestral nest, Blenheim Palace, was falling apart. He needed a miracle to save his ancestors' legacy. That miracle became the Vanderbilts' checkbook. But there was one hitch. The product, Consuelo, had her own will. In Paris, where Alva brought her daughter for the final processing, a drama worthy of a thriller unfolded. Consuelo confessed to her mother that she was secretly engaged to Winthrop Rutherford and planned to run away with him. Alva Vanderbilt's reaction was terrifying. She didn't start screaming. She simply locked the 18-year-old girl in the hotel room. Consuelo spent several weeks in captivity. She was forbidden to go out, forbidden to write letters. Guards were posted at the doors. Alva intercepted all of her daughter's correspondence. But the most powerful weapon became psychological blackmail. Alva, who possessed iron health, staged a deathbed scene. She told the doctors and her daughter that she had a serious heart defect, and any disobedience from Consuelo would kill her. "If you run away, you will become the murderer of your own mother," she said, lying in bed with fake medicine vials on the nightstand. Moreover, Alva coldly informed her daughter that if Winthrop Rutherford tried to approach her or interfere with the wedding, she would hire people to kill him. Consuelo had no reason to doubt. She knew that with her family's money, one could buy police, judges, and hitmen. Broken, intimidated, and isolated from the world, the girl surrendered. She wrote a rejection letter to Rutherford, dictated by her mother, and agreed to become a duchess. After that, the most cynical part of the story began: the lawyers' negotiations. This was not a discussion of the wedding menu. This was a corporate merger. Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, met with the Duke's representatives to discuss the price. The Duke haggled over every cent. The final marriage contract, a dry and ruthless document, fixed the following figures. The Vanderbilts transferred to the Duke $2.5 million in shares of the Beech Creek Railroad. This guaranteed him 4% annual income for life. In addition, a separate annual payment of $100,000 for the couple's maintenance was stipulated. The total deal amount, adjusted for 2024 rates, exceeded $100 million. For this money, the Duke of Marlborough was not selling love. He was selling his name. In fact, William Vanderbilt bought his daughter a place in British history at list price. The wedding, on November 6th, was merely the formal conclusion of the deal. Newspapers gushed with delight, describing diamonds and lace, but no one wrote about what happened in the church vestry immediately after the ceremony. There, while guests were getting into carriages, the newly minted Duke and Duchess didn't even look at each other. Consuelo recalled how, during the wedding breakfast, she felt not like a person, but like a trophy. People approached her, strangers congratulating her on her great fortune, touching her dress, appraising the pearls. She was the richest bride in the world, but she didn't have a cent in her pocket. All the money, per the contract, had passed under her husband's control. She was the most enviable match, but she was in love with another. The climax of this farce was the young couple's departure for England. When the ocean liner cast off from the New York pier, Consuelo stood on the deck, watching the Statue of Liberty recede. For the immigrants sailing toward it, that statue was a symbol of hope. For Consuelo Vanderbilt, it became a symbol of what she had lost forever. She was sailing to a foreign country, to strangers, with a man who, on their first wedding night, instead of words of love, would start discoursing on politics and the importance of producing an heir for the Spencer-Churchill dynasty. The dollar princess had fulfilled her purpose. The check had been cashed. Now she had to face what it had all been for: the cold, majestic, and ruthless Blenheim Palace. Welcome to Blenheim Palace, the only non-royal, non-episcopal country estate in England with the right to be called a palace. It was not just a house, it was a monument to military glory, a gift from Queen Anne to the first Duke of Marlborough for his victory over the French. And when 19-year-old Consuelo first saw this stone colossus rising above the misty hills of Oxfordshire, she understood one simple thing. She had not come to live. She had come to serve this building. So you understand the scale of her new prison. Blenheim is larger than Buckingham Palace and the White House combined. It has 187 rooms. The area of the roof alone is nearly 3 hectares. When Consuelo crossed the threshold, the palace greeted her not with the warmth of a home hearth, but with sepulchral cold. In these vast halls, with ceilings 15 meters high, there was no central heating. In winter, the water in the pitchers for washing froze overnight, turning to ice. The American heiress, accustomed to steam heating and hot water in her father's houses, found herself in the Middle Ages. But it was a very expensive Middle Ages. The first thing the Vanderbilt money did was start treating the palace. Roof repairs, installation of electricity, primitive heating systems. American dollars were absorbed into the ancient walls like water into dry sand, vanishing without a trace. Life inside Blenheim was governed by a protocol stricter than a military code. This stone ship was commanded by an invisible army of 80 servants. Hierarchy here was sacred. The Duchess had no right to simply go to the kitchen and ask for a glass of water. That would violate the age-old order. She had to ring a bell. A footman would come at the call, pass the request to the butler, who would give the order to another footman. The servants were shadows. Maidservants were obliged to turn to face the wall and freeze if the masters passed by in the corridor. No one had the right to speak to the Duke first. At the dining table, which was 10 meters long, husband and wife sat so far apart that they had to raise their voices to exchange phrases about the weather. The food was served by footmen in powdered wigs, a tradition that had died everywhere except Blenheim. By the time the dish was carried from the distant kitchen through a suite of cold halls to the table, it was already covered in congealed fat. Consuelo wrote that she felt like a doll in a museum display case. From the walls, portraits of her husband's ancestors looked down at her. Arrogant faces of people who seemed to ask, "Is this railroad magnate's daughter worthy to be among us?" The huge tapestry depicting the Battle of Blenheim weighed on her especially heavily, where dying soldiers and rearing horses reminded her of the price of power. But the worst was the loneliness. Her husband, having received the money, lost all interest in her. He spent his days hunting or in his studies, engaged in politics. In the evenings, they received guests, the cream of British aristocracy. But for these people, Consuelo remained a stranger. They laughed at her American accent, at her words elevator instead of lift, at her manner of dressing. They drank her wine, ate her food bought with her father's money, and whispered behind her back. Once, during a formal dinner, Consuelo tried to speak about politics. In the ensuing silence, one old countess said loudly, "American women are better off keeping silent and looking pretty. You have no history, you have only money." Consuelo swallowed the insult, as she had swallowed her tears all these months. The only task that this house and this husband set before her was biological production. The palace demanded an heir. The Duke told her directly, "I need a son to inherit the title, and another son in case the first dies." This sounded not like a dream of family, but like an order for spare parts for the dynastic machine. Every evening, Consuelo ascended to her bedroom, passing portraits of people who were strangers to her. She put on jewelry that weighed kilograms. The tiara squeezed her head, the corset cut off her breath. She looked in the mirror and saw there the richest woman in England, who had everything except the right to her own life. She lived in the scenery of a fairy tale, but the genre of this play was tragedy. In this golden aquarium, she began to suffocate. But it was precisely here, among cold stones and hostile glances, that character began to awaken in the fragile girl. Character inherited not from submissive Victorian women, but from her great-grandfather, the untamed Commodore. Consuelo realized, if she doesn't find a way to survive in this mausoleum, she will become just another portrait on the wall, a name in the family tree that will be forgotten in a generation. But for now, she fulfilled her duty. In due time, she gave birth to the heir, John, and then the spare, Ivor. The dynasty was saved. The roof was repaired. The contract fulfilled. And it was precisely at this moment, when the goal seemed achieved, that the facade of the ideal aristocratic family began to crack. The rot, so carefully hidden behind tapestries, began to show through. By the beginning of the 20th century, the task was accomplished. Consuelo had borne the heir and the spare. The Spencer-Churchill ducal line was secured for a century ahead, and the Blenheim Palace roof no longer leaked. In any fairy tale, this is where they put the period and write, "They lived happily ever after." But in reality, it was precisely at this moment that the real hell began. As soon as the need to pretend to be the ideal family for the sake of having children fell away, the masks were dropped. Behind the majestic facade of the palace hid a family rotting from within. Relations between the Duke and Duchess transitioned from cold politeness to icy hatred. They lived in one house, but as if on different planets. Blenheim was so vast that the spouses could not see each other for weeks, inhabiting different wings. But when they met, the air could be cut with a knife. Servants whispered to each other the details of their dinners. Imagine a table 10 meters long, set with silver and crystal. On one side sits the Duke, on the other, Consuelo. Between them, silence, broken only by the clink of cutlery. They could sit like that for 2 hours without uttering a word. The Duke used silence as a weapon. He ignored his wife's questions, looked through her, showing with his entire demeanor that she had fulfilled her biological function and was no longer of interest. When he finally opened his mouth, it was to humiliate her. The Duke was obsessed with etiquette and the purity of British traditions. Any manifestation of Consuelo's American liveliness elicited a grimace of disgust from him. If she laughed too loudly, he reprimanded her in front of the servants. If she used the wrong word, he corrected her like a schoolgirl. He methodically destroyed her self-esteem, trying to turn a living woman into a silent part of the interior. To keep from going mad, Consuelo began seeking solace outside the marriage. No, she did not become an alcoholic or get hooked on opium, like many bored aristocratesses of that time. Her drug became charity and public attention. She plunged headlong into helping the poor, visiting London's slums and shocking high society by the Duchess fussing over dirty children of the poor. This was her rebellion. The more her husband demanded primness, the more democratic she behaved. But there was another side. Consuelo was a young, incredibly beautiful woman, locked in a marriage with a man who did not love her. Naturally, men began to circle around her. London was rife with rumors. She was credited with affairs with her husband's cousins, with famous politicians, with artists. The Duke, in turn, openly resumed relations with his old mistresses. He didn't even try to hide it. For Victorian morality, this was normal for a man, but a scandal for a woman. Double standards flourished in full bloom. The situation heated up so much that even Consuelo's father, William Kissam Vanderbilt, realized he had made a mistake. The man who bought this marriage came to England and saw what his beloved daughter's life had turned into. For the first time in his life, this tough businessman felt guilt. And he decided to fix the situation in the only way he knew, with money. In 1906, a deal took place that finally formalized the family's collapse. Consuelo's father allocated another $2.5 million, a huge sum by those times, for the construction of a new house in London, Sunderland House. But this was not a gift to the couple. This was a house for Consuelo. Effectively, her father bought her the right to separate residence. In the same year, thunder struck. The Duke and Duchess of Marlborough announced an official legal separation. This was a shock. In Edwardian England, divorce was equivalent to social death. King Edward VII personally asked the couple to maintain the appearance of marriage for the sake of propriety. But the spouse's hatred was stronger than the king's will. Consuelo moved to London, taking her younger son with her. The Duke remained in Blenheim with the elder heir. The golden couple, whose portraits were printed on candy boxes and postcards, officially broke up. The public was perplexed. How could one be unhappy with so much money? But the most terrible thing in this period was that Consuelo could not obtain a full divorce. Under the laws of that time, a wife could divorce her husband only by proving both his adultery and cruelty simultaneously. And the adultery of an aristocratic husband was practically impossible to prove in court. She remained legally bound to him while being effectively free. She was neither widow nor wife, a woman in limbo. In this period, the rot manifested in the Duke himself. Left alone in his vast palace, he began turning into a misanthrope. He fired servants for the slightest infractions, quarreled with neighbors, and became increasingly strange. The Vanderbilt money saved the walls of his home, but destroyed his soul. He got the gold, but lost respect. And Consuelo? She was almost 30 years old. She had spent her youth fulfilling others' ambitions. She had money, a title, palaces, but lacked the main thing: love. Yet fate had a surprise in store for her. Precisely at this moment, when it seemed life was over, and only a lonely old age as a society lioness lay ahead, clouds of a real, great tragedy began gathering on the horizon. One that would eclipse all personal dramas. The world stood on the threshold of the First World War, and this cataclysm would ultimately change the rules of the game. The Great War of 1914 destroyed the Old World. European monarchies fell, empires crumbled to dust, and the golden glitter of the Jazz era replaced Victorian primness. But for Consuelo Vanderbilt, the true point of no return came not in the trenches of France, where she selflessly worked in hospitals, nor on the day of signing the official civil divorce in the 21st year. The culmination of her personal tragedy, the moment of truth that chills the blood, occurred in the quiet offices of the Vatican in 1926. This event entered legal history as one of the most cynical and at the same time heart-wrenching trials of the 20th century. The fact is that the civil divorce did not grant full freedom. The Duke of Marlborough, who by that time had converted to Catholicism, wanted to remarry his new paramour, the American Gladys Deacon. Consuelo, too, had met the man of her life, a French pilot and war hero, Jacques Balsan. But for the Church, their first marriage was still a sacred union, contracted in heaven. To break these bonds before God, a simple divorce was not enough. An annulment was required. It was necessary to prove that the marriage was invalid from the very first second, that there was no free consent. And for this, the sacred Roman Rota, the highest ecclesiastical court, demanded testimony from the main participants in that long-ago deal. And so, 31 years after the lavish wedding in New York, the truth came out. The main witness was Consuelo's mother, Alva, who by that time bore the surname Belmont. The Iron Lady, who once held all of New York in fear, was now a 73-year-old woman who had devoted the rest of her life to the fight for women's rights. The irony of fate. The leading suffragette of the era had to confess that she herself had trampled on her own daughter's rights. Alva's testimony before the tribunal reads like a protocol of a sincere confession to a crime. For the first time in her life, this proud woman did not lie. Under oath, she uttered words that forever tore the mask of well-being from the Vanderbilt family. "I forced my daughter to marry the Duke," Alva declared to the court. "I had absolute power over her. When I gave an order, no one dared to argue. I locked her in a room and threatened to murder her beloved. I simulated a heart attack to break her will. Consuelo was a marionette, and I pulled the strings." These words were documented by the court clerk. The mother officially confirmed that she had sold her daughter. The governess, Miss Harper, also summoned to court, supplemented the picture by telling of the bride's endless tears and how guards watched the doors to her bedroom. On November 19th, 1926, the Vatican issued its verdict. The marriage of Consuelo Vanderbilt and the Duke of Marlborough was declared annulled. From the Church's point of view, it had never existed. Think about the horror of this decision. 25 years of life, the birth of 2 sons, millions of dollars invested in palace repairs, thousands of receptions, smiles, handshakes, sleepless nights, humiliations, loneliness. All this was declared non-existent with one stroke of the pen. A legal fiction erased a quarter-century of suffering, declaring it a mistake. For Consuelo, this was liberation, but liberation with the taste of ashes. She finally became free to marry for love Jacques Balsan. But the price of this freedom was monstrous. Public admission that her youth had been stolen, and her children, formally, were born outside of a church marriage, although their legitimacy as title heirs was preserved by civil law. In this moment lies the main tragedy of the Gilded Age. The Vanderbilts' money was able to buy everything. First, they bought the Duke's title, violating the laws of love, and in the end, they essentially bought the Vatican's decision, violating the laws of time and memory. Many contemporaries whispered that the annulment cost the family a huge sum in donations to the church, although there were no direct proofs of a bribe. It seemed that for these people, nothing was sacred, neither the sacrament of marriage nor the sacrament of divorce. Everything was just clauses in a contract that could be rewritten if enough gold was paid. Meanwhile, the Duke of Marlborough, having obtained the desired freedom, immediately married Gladys Deacon. He thought that this time he would be happy. But the curse of the Vanderbilt money seemed to have seeped into the walls of Blenheim. His second marriage turned into an even greater nightmare. Gladys turned out to be mentally unbalanced. She bred spaniels in the palace that defecated on priceless carpets. And once, during a quarrel, she pulled out a revolver. Sonny died in loneliness and disappointment, never finding the peace he tried to buy with American millions. And what about Consuelo's father, the great William Kissam Vanderbilt? He did not live to see this shameful trial. He died in 1920. At the end of his life, this man who owned the world confessed to friends, "My life was a mad chase after phantoms." His fortune began to melt away. Taxes, the introduction of income tax in 1913, and the endless spending of heirs began to undermine the foundation of the empire. The annulment of the marriage became a point of no return, not only for Consuelo, but for the entire era. This was the official end of the fairy tale about princesses and castles. The world saw the underside. Behind the beautiful facade hid violence, blackmail, and deeply unhappy people. Consuelo survived and found the strength to start over at 49 years old. But that girl who cried in the carriage on the way to St. Thomas's Church died forever. And with her died the belief that happiness can be bought. Ahead was the finale. The Great Depression was already preparing to deliver its blow to finally bury the remnants of the Vanderbilt dynasty's luxury. Palaces built for centuries were preparing to meet the bulldozers. They say that the first generation creates the fortune, the second multiplies it, and the third squanders it. In the case of the Vanderbilt dynasty, this saying worked with the precision of a Swiss chronometer. The empire that seemed eternal collapsed, not from revolution or war. It was killed by simple arithmetic. The main enemy of the Vanderbilts was not a business competitor, but the 16th Amendment to the United States Constitution, adopted in 1913. It introduced the federal income tax, and then inheritance taxes appeared. The state, which previously allowed robber barons to accumulate mountains of gold, now decided to take its share, and this share proved fatal for the Gilded Age lifestyle. In the 20s of the 20th century, New York became a witness to a surreal spectacle. Those very palaces on Fifth Avenue, built for centuries in imitation of French chateaux and Italian palazzos, began to be demolished. The land beneath them became worth more than the buildings themselves. The heirs simply didn't have the money to maintain the army of servants and heat the gigantic halls. The most symbolic moment was the destruction of our heroine's childhood home, the Petit Chateau at Fifth Avenue, number 660. That very house where Consuelo was locked in a room. That very house that was a siege tower in the war against Mrs. Astor. In 1926, just 40 years after construction, bulldozers arrived at it. Imagine this picture. A crowd of onlookers, just like on the day of Consuelo's wedding, gathered at the fence. But now they were watching not the groom and bride, but how a huge cast-iron wrecking ball crashed into the elegant limestone carving. Fireplaces brought from French castles turned into rubble. Walls that had seen the most expensive balls of the century collapsed in a cloud of dust. Week after week, workers dismantled Alva Vanderbilt's ambitions brick by brick. In place of the fairy tale palace, a faceless office skyscraper rose. The fate of the Marble House in Newport, that very summer prison of Consuelo, was even more humiliating. Alva, who spent $11 million on its construction, or $350 million in modern equivalent, sold it in 1932 in the midst of the Great Depression. The deal price was only $100,000. Ponder these figures. $11 million invested against $100,000 profit. This was not just a financial loss. This was the epitaph for the entire era. The house was sold for less than 1% of its cost. Furniture, paintings, tapestries went under the hammer for a song. New rich, who made their money on war or automobiles, snapped up the remnants of the Vanderbilt empire like souvenirs. Consuelo herself observed this disintegration from afar. Having found happiness in her second marriage to Jacques Balsan, she lived in France, in the beautiful villa Le Suy. But the curse of history caught up with her there, too. In 1940, as Nazi troops approached Paris, the 63-year-old Consuelo and her husband were forced to flee. The former Duchess, accustomed to special trains and private yachts, slept on the floor in an overcrowded Spanish consulate, trying to get a visa, and stood in lines for bread. War equalized everyone. She returned to America, but the America she knew no longer existed. The Vanderbilt Row had vanished from New York's map. Her relatives, who once owned the whole world, now lived in ordinary apartments, worked as clerks, or lived on modest interest from trust funds. The mathematics of the fall was inexorable. When, in 1973, 120 descendants of Cornelius Vanderbilt gathered for the first family reunion at Vanderbilt University, there was not a single millionaire among them. The fortune, which in modern equivalent amounted to $200 billion, evaporated without a trace in less than 100 years. Where did the money go? It went to maintaining yachts that rusted in docks, to balls remembered only by historians, to buying titles that brought no happiness, to divorce lawyers, to payoffs to blackmailers, and, of course, to building those very palaces that now existed only in old black-and-white photographs. Consuelo spent her final days in a relatively modest house on Long Island. She was no longer a dollar princess. She was an elderly woman who wrote memoirs, trying to make sense of why all that madness had been necessary. In her book, The Glitter and the Gold, she described with astonishing honesty the emptiness of the life imposed on her. She died in 1964, outliving her despotic father, her cruel mother, her unloved first husband, and her beloved second husband. She outlived the era itself. When she was buried, standing by her grave in Oxfordshire, were not kings and emperors, but simply her children and grandchildren. The circle closed. The great wealth returned to the non-existence from which it came. But did it disappear without a trace? Did anything remain besides the dust of demolished mansions and faded newspaper clippings? The answer to this question lies in the paradox with which we began. The money disappeared, but it bought something that cannot be sold at auction. It bought a place in eternity. And to see this legacy, we need to transport ourselves to the present day. Turn on the television. Switch to the CNN channel. Most likely, you will see a gray-haired man in an elegant suit who, with professional restraint, reports on wars, political crises, and hurricanes. This is Anderson Cooper, one of America's most respected journalists. He does not bear the Vanderbilt name, but the Commodore's blood flows in his veins. He is the great-great-grandson of that very Cornelius who started with a boat in the harbor, and the grandnephew of our heroine, Consuelo. Anderson Cooper is the living answer to the question of how the story of America's greatest fortune ended. In his book and numerous interviews, he openly says, "I received no inheritance. My mother told me right away, there are no trust funds." And this is true. The money that once exceeded the US budget dissolved. But look at the irony of fate. Anderson Cooper earns his living through hard work, laboring 12 hours a day, just like his distant ancestor, the Commodore. The cycle closed. After 150 years, the Vanderbilts are working again to live. But if the bank accounts emptied, the physical trace of this family, and specifically Consuelo's sacrifice, remained, and it is grandiose. If you buy a ticket to London today and take a train to Oxfordshire, you will find yourself at the gates of Blenheim Palace. Today, it is a UNESCO World Heritage Site. Every year, nearly 1 million tourists pass through those very halls where Consuelo suffocated from loneliness. You have surely seen these interiors, even if you have never been to England. Recall the Harry Potter films, Mission Impossible, 007 Spectre, or the recent hit, Napoleon. They were all filmed at Blenheim. The palace lives, it thrives, it shines with gold. But few of the tourists taking selfies against the majestic facade know that they are looking at the converted dowry of an American girl. The roof that protects priceless collections from English rains was relaid with Vanderbilt money. The famous water terraces, considered a masterpiece of landscape design, were built at Consuelo's personal order and on her father's checks. The library, where thousands of volumes are stored, was restored using shares of the Beach Creek Railroad Company. If we conduct a thought experiment and remove from Blenheim everything that was paid for with the dollars of the deal of the century, the palace would turn into ruins. But there is a legacy far more important than stone and limestone. This is the butterfly effect in geopolitics. The money that came with Consuelo allowed the Spencer-Churchill family to preserve their political influence and social status at a critical moment in history. It was precisely in this family, in this very saved palace, that Sir Winston Churchill was born and raised. He was the cousin of Consuelo's husband and her close friend for life. Historians still argue, if the Vanderbilts had not saved Blenheim from bankruptcy in 1895, would that environment that shaped the character of the future Prime Minister have been preserved? Winston Churchill often visited Sonny and Consuelo. American money ensured the functioning of that base, that aristocratic rear, which allowed Churchill to engage in big politics without worrying about a piece of bread. One can say that in the victory over Nazism, there is a tiny, invisible share of participation from Consuelo Vanderbilt's tears. Without her sacrifice, British history might have taken a different path. Another echo of this story we find in modern pop culture. The dramaturgy of the Gilded Age continues to feed Hollywood. The creator of the series Downton Abbey, Julian Fellowes, in his new project, The Gilded Age, practically verbatim quotes our heroine's story through the character Gladys Russell. We watch these balls, these dresses, this cruelty again and again because we are fascinated by this terrible exchange. Human happiness for eternal greatness. And what in America? What remains of Alva Vanderbilt's ambitions on her homeland? The mansions on Fifth Avenue disappeared, but if you come to Newport, Rhode Island, you can buy a ticket to the Marble House. Today, it is a museum. You can enter that very bedroom where Consuelo was kept locked up. You can see that very Gothic room designed by her mother. Now it is national heritage. And here lies the main philosophical paradox of the dynasty. If the Vanderbilts had been modest, thrifty Puritans, if they had not spent millions on mad palaces, but simply kept the money in the bank, their fortune would still have disappeared. Inflation, devaluation, taxes, the 1929 crisis, division of inheritance among hundreds of descendants, all this would have turned $200 million into dust. No one today would remember the name of William Kissam Vanderbilt. But because they spent that money so wastefully and so grandiosely, they achieved immortality. They converted temporary financial assets into eternal cultural assets. We remember them not for how much they earned, but for how beautifully they lost it. New York Central Station, Vanderbilt University in Nashville, the Newport Museums. These are monuments to their extravagance that became a gift to future generations. Let us return to the image with which we began. 1895. The tearful girl in the carriage. Was it worth it? For Consuelo herself, undoubtedly no. She paid for this contribution to history with her youth and broken heart. But history is a cynical accountant. It doesn't care about one girl's tears. The result matters to it. And the result is this: American new money saved old Europe, created cultural monuments, and gave birth to stories that will captivate people for centuries more. Consuelo Vanderbilt is buried in England, in St. Martin's Church in Bladen, next to her son, and not far from Winston Churchill's grave. There is no mention on her headstone of how much her dowry cost. It simply says, Consuelo Vanderbilt Balsan. In the end, she reclaimed her name. She ceased to be just a duchess or a commodity. Her life is a warning and a lesson for us, inhabitants of the 21st century. We live in a new Gilded Age, when tech moguls build their rockets and bunkers, competing in wealth just as the Vanderbilts once competed in yachts. Consuelo's story reminds us of a simple truth. You can buy a title, you can buy a palace, you can even buy an annulment from the Pope. But you cannot buy someone who will hold your hand when the spotlights go out. Wealth is a loud cry that fades after a generation, and human tragedy is a whisper that, thanks to such stories, is heard for centuries. The Vanderbilt Empire fell. Their money turned to dust, but the tears of the dollar princess froze into eternity, transforming into history's hardest diamonds. And now, when you pass by the luxurious facades of modern billionaires or scroll through social media feeds of their beautiful lives, remember Consuelo. Remember that behind every perfect golden facade, there always, absolutely always, hides someone's personal, invisible to the world, prison. This was the story of the world's most expensive bride.